Hi, I'm Claire Whittle. I'm a farm vet and I work in the Cheshire-Shropshire borders. I also moonlight as a vet for a little group called Dung Beetles for Farmers. So any of the information that I'm going to talk to you guys about today, if you want to have a little look online at dungbeetlesforfarmers.co.uk, there's a lot more information on there which is available for you to look at. So I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit first about dung beetles and why they're so important to us, particularly in our farming environments. And they are incredible ecosystem engineers. So we actually have two types of dung beetles in the UK. We have dwellers and we have tunnelers. So the dwellers do exactly that. They spend their entire life cycle within the pat or just below it. And they're really important because they actually suck the liquid portion out of the dung. And in doing so, they dry that pat out so they can increase our pasture availability, our forage availability, if you like. And then they also reduce the available habitat for our pest creatures to be able to complete their life cycles. So our parasitic worms and our pest flies that are a nuisance in our cattle, if they have really dry poo, they're going to be unable to complete their life cycles. And then we also have our tunnelling species. So these are the big guys, which you can see up here on the screen. And these are our geotroopids. And these guys are super cool. So they're one of the biggest beetles that we actually have in the UK. And their job is actually to tunnel down underneath the pat. So they take our poo from the top of our pasture, they pull it down into the earth, and then the dung beetles actually lay their eggs inside brood balls underneath the ground. So if we're talking about like carbon sequestration, for example, we want all that lovely poo under the ground where it can be stored and where we can get some more nutrient cycling going. Dung beetles are actually really important when we talk about farm biodiversity, particularly when we're facing such a huge biodiversity loss. Now, not just dung beetles, but a whole host of other insects actually live inside our pats. So the argument is, if a single pat holds 1,000 insects, then how great are cows in our landscape? They're also very important prey species for lots of other creatures. So wading birds really rely on our dung, and you'll often see holes in them in your fields, and that's usually birds digging through your pats looking for beetles and larvae and various other things in there as well. Dung beetles are also really detrimentally affected by some of the practices we employ in agriculture. One of those things would be worming our cattle, and potentially even worming our cattle too frequently. So what are the ways we can help dung beetles on our farms? And one of those is by doing fecal egg counts to try and reduce our wormer usage. Fecal egg counting is also really important because not only is it for dung beetles, but also we're facing more and more anthelmintic or wormer resistance in our livestock. So protecting the wormers that we have and using them only when necessary is really important. So trying to use as little as possible will definitely help those dung beetles and also reduce the risk of you suffering with wormer resistance on your farm. So in terms of how to get the best fecal egg count, the first thing is hygiene. So you'll notice that I'm wearing gloves today. You don't want to be digging around in muck because there's lots of things in muck that we can get that we really don't want. So timing of fecal egg counts is really important, and I would tend to start fecal egg counting about 4 to 6 weeks post turnout. Now the reason for that is our gutworm life cycle is usually about 21 days. So if you take a sample about 2 weeks after turnout, you're potentially going to get a falsely negative result, as it takes a full 3 weeks to get through the animal and come out of its back end. So 4 to 6 weeks post turnout, best time to start. And then you really need to repeat them throughout the season. So again, repeating them every 4 to 6 weeks is really important to give us an overview of what's going on in your animals over time. The other thing that's really important is the number. So in terms of the number of samples that you're collecting should be representative of the number of animals in the group. So ideally a minimum of 10 samples from each management group. The reason we have to get samples from each management group is because even if you have the same animals in 2 different fields, it's possible that the pasture in one field was managed differently the previous year, so you want samples from each management group. The samples should be as fresh as possible, so ideally they want to be collected as the animals pass muck. So a really good time to take them is often when you go in the field in the morning, all the animals stand up, and usually the first thing they do is drop a load of muck onto pasture, so that's a really good time to take them. I would collect them individually as well, so these pots are really useful for collecting samples, and we will pool them for you either at the vets or they will do that for you at the lab, but try to collect them individually because we need such a small amount per animal that collecting a lot in one go is not very useful. So about 40 grams per animal is enough, and one of these pots is great because they're about the right size if you need to fill them up to the top. And the other thing you really want to do is make sure you expel as much air from it as possible, and that just keeps it really fresh. Now the reason we need the samples fresh is because once your poo has landed on the pasture, the eggs start to hatch out into worms, and then again we can get a falsely negative result. So we want to catch the eggs. So getting these as fresh as possible, pick them up off the pasture, get them straight to us is really useful. Samples should be examined as soon as possible, or they can be kept in the fridge a couple of days, which halts the life cycle, but really get them to us as soon as you can. You can send them directly to the labs yourself as well, and again, just make sure they're well packaged. Speak to your vet about how to package them up. And if you are going to be doing them yourself, just make sure you do some quality control. So at the start of every season, I always send my first couple of samples away to the lab just to make sure my counts match up with what their counts are saying. I would never use worm egg counts in isolation. So whenever I go out to take samples, I'm looking at the whole group of animals. So I'll look at things like body condition score. I'll maybe body condition score 10 animals. I'll also look at the percentage of mucky bums, how many animals have got loose muck, whether any of them are coughing, and those things will play into whether or not I choose to worm those animals or not. And I'm comparing them to the last time that I saw them every single time I do it. So the other reason why using less wormers is really important is that wormer resistance is becoming an increasing problem. We've seen it increasing in sheep over the years, and we're starting to see more in cattle. Wormer resistance is the loss of sensitivity to a drug in a worm population that was previously sensitive to that drug, and that can build up over time. When we use wormers regularly without testing, and if they don't need to be used, then we're increasing the risk of wormer resistance. So every single time that you worm, there is a population of resistant worms that is left inside that animal. So we want to reduce our use where possible. Another thing that increases the risk of wormer resistance is dosing and moving. So we used to historically say we would dose our animals and then we put them straight onto clean pasture. Nowadays what we realise is that if we do that, if we dose them and they immediately go onto clean pasture, the only worms that end up hitting that pasture are the resistant worms that have survived the treatment. Ideally, what we'd like to do is leave the animals on dirty pasture for a couple of days to drop all those resistant worms, and then they can breed with the sensitive worms on the pasture. Underdosing is another way we can increase the risk of resistance in our cattle. So always dosing for the right weight is really important, and also checking the calibration of your dosing guns every single time that you use them. So if it says it's dosing 10 ml, empty that out into a bowl, suck it up with a syringe and see if it is actually dosing 10 ml, because underdosing is a real risk of increasing your wormer resistance on the farm. Do you need to worm all the animals on your farm? So if you could pick the top 10 or 20% that are growing really well, chances are they don't have a worm problem. And also adult animals really don't necessarily need to be wormed. If they've had at least 2 grazing seasons on your farm, chances are they've built up some resilience to wormers, and they will not need to be wormed. Animals actually need to come in contact with some worms in order to build their own immunity. So that's really important when we're thinking about wormer use, and particularly when we're using things like lungworm vaccination, which works by the animals receiving the vaccination and then actually having some exposure to lungworm on the pasture. So having discussions with your vet is very, very important when it comes to parasite control on your farm.